Hey everyone, I'm here to help you unwind and drift off tonight. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you get too cozy, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more relaxing content. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Now find a comfortable spot, take a deep breath, and let's begin to relax. In the quiet, fog-drenched town of Ravenswood, whispers floated among the townsfolk about a mysterious figure known as the Midnight Doll Maker. For decades, the legend persisted, a shadowy recluse who emerged only in the dead of night to create lifelike dolls, each eerily resembling someone from the town. No one had ever seen him work, but his creations would inexplicably appear on doorsteps, perched on windowsills, or displayed in the town square by sunrise. Some marveled at the craftsmanship, while others shuddered at the uncanny resemblance to the living. Ravenswood was a small town where secrets thrived. Most people worked modest jobs, fishermen, shopkeepers, school teachers, but beneath their polite smiles and pleasant chatter lay a subtle undercurrent of dread. Each year, on the same autumn night, another doll would surface, bearing the unmistakable features of a resident. And within weeks, the person who inspired the doll would vanish without a trace. The townsfolk avoided speaking of it openly, for fear that acknowledging the pattern might somehow draw the doll maker's attention. Children were warned not to wander after dark, and the streets were deserted by dusk. Over time, some residents left Ravenswood, but others, tethered by family or stubborn roots, stayed and lived in quiet paranoia. The legend might have remained unchallenged had it not been for Eliza Monroe, a young journalist with a penchant for chasing the macabre. Assigned to write a piece about Ravenswood's peculiar history, she arrived in town during its most ominous season, late October, when the air was crisp and the shadows seemed to breathe. Eliza was skeptical of the Midnight Doll Maker. To her, the story reeked of superstition and small-town hysteria. Determined to uncover the truth, she rented a room at the local inn and spent her days interviewing the wary townsfolk. Most were reluctant to speak, offering only hushed warnings and sidelong glances. "There's no sense in poking around," warned Mrs. O'Malley, the innkeeper. "Some stories are better left untold." But Eliza was undeterred. The more she dug, the more she uncovered unsettling patterns, missing persons reports, unexplained sightings, and cryptic notes left near the dolls. One crisp, moonlit evening, as Eliza reviewed her notes by candlelight, she noticed something peculiar. Across the cobblestone street, in the window of an abandoned toy shop, stood a doll. Its delicate face was eerily familiar. Sharp cheekbones, chestnut hair, and piercing green eyes. Eliza gasped. It was her. The doll stood perfectly still, its tiny hands clasped before it, dressed in a miniature version of the very outfit Eliza was wearing. Her heart pounded as she stumbled to the window for a closer look, but by the time she reached it, the doll was gone. The shop stood empty, its broken shutters swaying in the breeze. The next morning, Eliza confronted the townsfolk at the market square. "Who's behind this? Who makes the dolls?" she demanded. The crowd murmured uneasily, avoiding her gaze. Finally, an elderly man named Mr. Grayson stepped forward. "We don't know who he is," he said, "but we know when he'll come. Always on All Hallows Eve." Grayson explained that the Midnight Doll Maker had first appeared nearly a century ago. Some believed he was a gifted toy maker who'd gone mad after losing his family in a fire. Others claimed he was a ghost cursed to immortalize his victims in doll form. The only certainty was that those who received a doll were doomed to disappear. Eliza decided she wouldn't wait to become the doll maker's next victim. That night, armed with a flashlight and a camera, she staked out the abandoned toy shop, determined to catch the Midnight Doll Maker in the act. The hours dragged on, and the cold seeped into her bones. Just as she began to doubt her plan, a faint creaking sound echoed through the night. A figure emerged from the shadows, cloaked in black, carrying a wooden case. Eliza held her breath as the figure entered the toy shop. Through a crack in the door, she watched as he opened the case, revealing an assortment of tools, tiny chisels, brushes, and vials of paint. With meticulous precision, he began carving a doll, his movements fluid and almost hypnotic. To her horror, the doll's face began to take shape, and it was unmistakably hers. Summoning her courage, Eliza burst into the shop, camera flashing. The doll maker froze, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. For a moment they stared at each other, and then he spoke, his voice a low rasp. "You shouldn't have come here." "Why are you doing this?" Eliza demanded. "What do you want?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached for the unfinished doll. Before Eliza could react, the shop seemed to shift and warp around her. The walls blurred, and a dizzying vertigo overtook her. When she awoke, she was no longer in the shop, but standing in the town square. In her hands was the finished doll. The next morning, Eliza's room at the inn was empty. The townsfolk found her doll on the steps of the town hall, its lifelike eyes gazing into the distance. Despite her disappearance, her camera was discovered in the abandoned shop, containing a single photo, blurry but unmistakable. It showed the midnight doll maker's face, pale and hauntingly familiar. Some claimed it resembled a young man who had vanished from the town years ago. Eliza's story became another chapter in the midnight doll maker's legend. Some say her determination to uncover the truth had sealed her fate. Others believe she succeeded in unmasking him and was taken as punishment. The dolls continued to appear each year, as lifelike and unnerving as ever. And though Ravenswood's residents whispered about leaving, most stayed, tethered by fear, tradition, or something more inexplicable. As for the midnight doll maker, his true identity and motives remained a mystery. But one thing was certain: his work was far from finished. In the northern reaches of a quiet country, there lay a dense, ancient woodland known to the locals as the Whispering Forest. The name itself was steeped in foreboding and curiosity, a title earned by the mysterious voices that seemed to echo through its trees, especially at dusk. Some said it was the wind weaving through the gnarled branches, while others believed the forest held secrets far older than humanity itself. Whatever the truth, few dared to venture deep into its heart, for fear of never returning. Generations of villagers passed down tales of the forest and the fate of those who entered. It was said that the whispers were not merely sound, but a lure, soft voices that promised secrets, knowledge, or even power. The forest was rumored to be alive, a sentient being that fed on the hopes and fears of those who wandered beneath its canopy. Stories of disappearances abounded. Children, hunters, and even travelers unfamiliar with the area were said to vanish without a trace. The most chilling accounts came from the few who returned. Their eyes hollow and haunted, they spoke of disembodied voices calling their names, shadows moving where no light fell, and a terrible sense of being watched. Despite the warnings, there were always those who couldn't resist the allure of the Whispering Forest. Among them was Dr. Eleanor Hart, a renowned folklorist and skeptic. Eleanor had spent years debunking myths and legends across the globe, and the Whispering Forest was her next challenge. To her, the stories were nothing more than exaggerated folklore, a product of fear and superstition. Eleanor arrived in the nearby village of Greystone in late autumn, when the forest was at its most picturesque. The fiery hues of the leaves and the crispness of the air masked the sinister reputation of the woods. Armed with notebooks, recording equipment, and a steely resolve, She intended to spend a week documenting the phenomena and uncovering the truth. The villagers were less than welcoming. To them, Eleanor's presence was an affront to their long-held fears. "You shouldn't go in there, miss," warned Mr. Thatcher, the local blacksmith. "The forest doesn't like intruders." "I've heard it all before," Eleanor replied with a polite smile. "There's always a logical explanation." "Logic won't help you when the forest starts whispering your name," muttered Mrs. Thatcher, crossing herself. Despite their protests, Eleanor was determined. On the morning of her first expedition, she strapped on her hiking boots, slung her pack over her shoulder, and set off toward the forest. The forest was breathtaking, its towering trees intertwined like the ribs of some ancient beast. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting shifting patterns on the mossy ground. At first it seemed peaceful, even serene. Eleanor marveled at the quiet, her footsteps muffled by the thick layer of fallen leaves. She spent the day taking notes, sketching the peculiar shapes of the trees, and setting up her recording equipment to capture the so-called whispers. By evening, her skepticism remained intact. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a bird. As the sun dipped below the horizon, however, the atmosphere began to change. The air grew colder, and an uncanny stillness settled over the forest. It was then that Eleanor heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. She froze, straining to listen. The sound was faint, like the murmur of distant voices carried on the wind. Her rational mind dismissed it as a natural phenomenon, but a shiver ran down her spine nonetheless. Eleanor set up camp in a small clearing. She lit a fire and made notes about the whispers, theorizing that they were caused by the unique acoustics of the forest. She reviewed the recordings on her equipment but heard nothing unusual. As the night deepened, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They seemed to come from all around her, though no one was there. Eleanor tried to sleep, but her rest was fitful, plagued by dreams of shadowy figures and echoing voices. In the early hours of the morning, she awoke with a start. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. And then, from the darkness, came a single, chilling word. Eleanor. Over the next few days, Eleanor's skepticism began to waver. The whispers grew bolder, calling her name with increasing frequency. She found strange symbols carved into the bark of trees, patterns that didn't match any she'd seen before. Her equipment, once reliable, began to malfunction. Eleanor also began to feel watched. No matter where she went, she couldn't shake the sensation of eyes following her every move. Once she glimpsed a figure in the distance, a pale silhouette slipping between the trees. When she pursued it, she found nothing but an empty clearing. Her notes became erratic, filled with fragmented thoughts and desperate questions. Was the forest truly alive? Were the whispers a form of communication? Or was she succumbing to the hysteria that plagued those who entered? On the fifth day, Eleanor decided to venture deeper into the forest, determined to reach its heart. She followed the whispers, which now seemed to guide her, though she couldn't tell if they were leading her toward answers or doom. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining to form an almost impenetrable canopy. The air became thick and heavy, and an eerie glow seemed to emanate from the ground itself. Finally, she arrived at a clearing unlike any other. At its center stood an ancient tree, gnarled and massive, its roots twisting like serpents. Symbols covered its bark, glowing faintly in the dim light. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices speaking in an unknown language. Eleanor approached the tree, her heart pounding. She placed a hand on its bark, and the world around her seemed to dissolve. In an instant, Eleanor was overwhelmed by visions. She saw the forest as it had been centuries ago, a sacred place where ancient rituals were performed. She saw the spirits of the forest, ethereal beings bound to the land, neither malevolent nor benevolent, but deeply connected to the natural world. She also saw the truth of the whispers. They were not lures or warnings, but memories, echoes of those who had come before. The forest absorbed the essence of every soul that entered, preserving their thoughts, fears, and desires. When the visions ended, Eleanor found herself back in the clearing. The whispers had ceased, and the forest was silent once more. Eleanor emerged from the whispering forest forever changed. She returned to Greystone, but her once sharp mind was clouded, her words fragmented. She spoke of the forest's sentience and its purpose, but few believed her. In time, Eleanor vanished, her belongings left untouched in her room at the inn. Some say she returned to the forest, drawn by its whispers. Others believe the forest claimed her as it had so many before. The whispering forest remains, its secrets intact, its whispers waiting for the next curious soul to listen. The village of Cold Hollow was a place trapped in time. Nestled deep in the rolling hills and thick woods of the countryside, it was a place where progress seemed to stop centuries ago. Its cobblestone streets, ivy-covered cottages, and the imposing silhouette of the old church bell tower lent an air of picturesque charm to outsiders. But for those who lived there, Cold Hollow was anything but charming. It was a place haunted by whispers of tragedy, a single dark legend passed down through generations. The story of the forgotten child. The story began over a century ago with a young girl named Clara. She was a quiet child, often overlooked by the bustling townsfolk. Her father, a widowed farmer, struggled to provide for her, and her presence became more of a burden than a blessing. One winter, tragedy struck. Clara's father succumbed to illness, leaving her orphaned and alone. The villagers, preoccupied with their own hardships, turned a blind eye. Though she wandered the streets with hollow eyes and frost-bitten hands, no one offered her shelter. One frigid night, Clara disappeared. Some said she had wandered into the forest, seeking solace. Others believed she had been taken by wolves. By the time spring came, her small frozen body was found at the edge of the woods. Racked with guilt, the villagers buried her in an unmarked grave behind the churchyard. But the guilt was not enough to stop the whispers, nor was it enough to keep Clara from returning. The first signs of Clara's presence began subtly, a cold draft sweeping through homes, the faint sound of footsteps when no one was there, or the soft hum of a child's lullaby carried on the wind. Then came the visions. People reported glimpses of a pale girl in a tattered dress standing at the edge of the forest, her hollow eyes watching silently. At first she seemed harmless, merely an echo of a life cut short. But as the years went by, her appearances grew more sinister. Children claimed to hear her calling their names at night, her voice soft and sorrowful. Some even said she would appear in their rooms, her frost-bitten hands reaching out for them. Those who ventured too close to the forest often disappeared, their bodies never found. The villagers came to believe that Clara had become a vengeful spirit, punishing them for their neglect. She was no longer just a tragic figure. She was a warning, a reminder of what happens when a child is forgotten. For decades, the story of Clara faded into the background, becoming little more than a ghost story told to scare misbehaving children. But when Sarah Bennett, a young journalist, moved to Cold Hollow, the legend resurfaced. Sarah had grown tired of city life and sought the tranquility of a rural escape. Cold Hollow, with its quaint charm and rich history, seemed like the perfect place to start fresh. She had heard the story of the forgotten child, but dismissed it as mere folklore. But shortly after moving into her cottage on the edge of the forest, strange things began to happen. At night, she heard soft knocking at her windows, though no one was there. Her belongings would be inexplicably moved, and the temperature in her home would drop suddenly, even with the fire roaring. One evening, as she worked late into the night, she caught movement out of the corner of her eye. Turning to the window, she froze. There, standing just beyond the glass, was a small girl with pale skin and hollow eyes. The girl didn't move or speak. She simply stared. Shaken but determined, Sarah decided to investigate the legend of the forgotten child. She visited the village elders, who reluctantly recounted the tale of Clara. Most warned her not to dig too deeply. "Some things are better left buried," one old woman whispered, her hands trembling. Undeterred, Sarah scoured the village archives, poring over old records and diaries. She discovered accounts of Clara's life and death, but also something unexpected: a pattern. Every few decades, children from the village had gone missing, always around the same time of year. Sarah's curiosity deepened into obsession. She began exploring the forest, searching for clues about Clara's death. The deeper she ventured, the more unsettling the woods became. Shadows seemed to move on their own, and whispers followed her wherever she went. One day, she stumbled upon an old, crumbling gravestone hidden beneath a thicket of vines. The name was worn away, but the carving of a single rose marked it as Clara's. Beside the grave was a small, weathered doll, its face cracked and faded. That night, Sarah awoke to the sound of laughter, high-pitched and chilling. The air in her cottage was icy, her breath visible in the dim light. Slowly, she turned toward the foot of her bed. Clara stood there, her expression a mix of sorrow and anger. Her lips moved, but her voice seemed to echo from all around. "Why did you leave me?" Sarah's heart pounded as she tried to respond, but no sound came out. Clara stepped closer, her hollow eyes filled with tears. "I was so cold, so alone." Summoning her courage, Sarah whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what they did to you." For a moment, Clara's expression softened, but then the whispers began again, louder and more insistent. The room seemed to warp and shift as Clara's form flickered, her sorrow giving way to rage. "You can't leave," she hissed. "Not like they did." Desperate to appease the spirit, Sarah remembered the doll she had found by the grave. She had taken it home, not realizing its significance. She retrieved it and held it out toward Clara. "This is yours," Sarah said. "You were never forgotten." Clara hesitated, her spectral form wavering. Slowly, she reached out and took the doll. The whispers ceased and the room grew warmer. For a brief moment, Clara's face lit up with a childlike innocence. Then, she was gone. Sarah remained in Cold Hollow, documenting her experience and working to ensure Clara's story was never forgotten again. The villagers, inspired by her courage, erected a proper gravestone for Clara, adorned with flowers and toys. Though the hauntings ceased, the forest retained its eerie atmosphere. Visitors claimed to hear faint laughter and catch glimpses of a young girl playing among the trees. But this time the presence felt less vengeful and more at peace. The forgotten child was no longer a figure of fear, but a symbol of remembrance, a reminder of the cost of neglect and the enduring power of love. Elderwood Asylum was a sprawling Gothic structure perched on the edge of a misty forest in rural Maine. Built in 1892, it was initially designed as a place of refuge for those deemed lost to society, the mentally ill, the criminally insane, and anyone who didn't fit the rigid norms of the era. Over the decades, Elderwood gained an ominous reputation. Patients spoke of strange noises in the night, shadowy figures lurking in the halls, and an oppressive sense of dread that seemed to emanate from the very walls. By 1954, the asylum was shut down amid allegations of mistreatment and mysterious deaths. Officially, it was abandoned, but locals swore they could still hear faint screams and laughter drifting from its broken windows. Generations of teenagers dared each other to explore its ruins, but few lasted more than a few minutes inside. Elderwood wasn't just haunted, it was cursed. In 2024, a group of filmmakers set out to make a documentary about haunted locations across America. Elderwood Asylum was their pièce de résistance. Led by Rachel Carter, a seasoned journalist fascinated by the paranormal, the crew included her cameraman Ethan, sound technician Mia, and historian Dr. Leonard Gray. Their goal was simple: spend 5 nights in Elderwood, documenting its history and any paranormal activity. Armed with cameras, recording devices, and a mountain of skepticism, they arrived in late October just as the autumn leaves turned blood red. The first night was uneventful. The team set up their equipment in the main lobby, a cavernous space with crumbling walls and a shattered skylight. Dust floated in the air, illuminated by the faint glow of their lanterns. Dr. Gray recounted the asylum's history for the camera, describing its dark past. Elderwood was a place of horror, masquerading as a sanctuary, he said. Patients were subjected to cruel experiments, electroshock therapy, lobotomies, and worse. Many died here, their suffering etched into the very fabric of this place. Despite the grim tales, nothing unusual occurred that night. Rachel was almost disappointed. Maybe the ghosts are shy, Ethan joked as they reviewed the footage. But Mia, who had been unusually quiet, muttered, "Or maybe they're waiting." On the second night, the team explored the West Wing, known as the Whispering Hallway. Legend had it that patients in this wing often spoke of hearing disembodied whispers, voices that coaxed them into violence or despair. As they walked the decaying corridor, the air grew colder. Their breath became visible, and the oppressive silence was broken by faint whispers. At first it was indistinct, a murmur of overlapping voices. But as they moved deeper into the hallway, the words became clearer. "Help me. Why did you leave? Don't trust them." Mia's handheld recorder began to crackle, and she froze. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Rachel nodded, her heart racing. "It's coming from the end of the hall." The whispers led them to a room with the door hanging off its hinges. Inside, they found a patient's journal, its pages brittle and yellowed with age. The entries were erratic, filled with scribbles and frantic writing. One line stood out: "The doctor sees everything. He knows we can't leave." By the third night, tensions were high. The team reviewed their footage and discovered something chilling: shadows moving in the background, though no one had been there. Ethan set up motion-activated cameras throughout the asylum, determined to capture more evidence. Meanwhile, Rachel and Dr. Gray explored the basement, where the most violent patients had been kept in solitary confinement. The air was damp and foul, the walls lined with rusted iron bars. As they walked, their flashlights flickered. Rachel felt an icy hand graze her shoulder, but when she turned, no one was there. Dr. Gray, visibly shaken, pointed to a wall where the words, "Leave now," were scrawled in what looked like dried blood. "I think we should go back upstairs," he said, his voice trembling, but Rachel was resolute. "We can't stop now. This is why we're here." The fourth night was chaos. Ethan, who had been the most skeptical of the group, began acting strangely. He claimed to hear voices calling his name and spent hours wandering the asylum alone, muttering to himself. When the group found him in the operating theater, he was sitting in a rusted wheelchair staring at the ceiling. "They're here," he said, his voice monotone. "They've always been here." Mia, clutching her rosary, tried to snap him out of it. "Ethan, we need to leave. Now." But Ethan only laughed, a low, guttural sound that didn't seem to belong to him. "You can't leave. The doctor won't let you." Suddenly, the lights on their cameras flickered, and the room was plunged into darkness. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed around them, though no one could see who or what was coming. By the fifth night, the team was unraveling. Ethan was unresponsive, Mia was on the verge of a breakdown, and even Rachel was questioning whether they had made a mistake. Dr. Gray suggested leaving, but Rachel refused. "We can't go back without finishing this. We're so close." Determined to uncover the truth, Rachel returned to the whispering hallway alone. She carried the journal she'd found, hoping to piece together the mystery of Elderwood. As she read aloud, the whispers grew louder. The temperature dropped, and the shadows in the hallway began to move. Then she saw him, a figure in a long coat with hollow eyes and a scalpel in his hand. "The doctor," she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure lunged, and Rachel ran, her flashlight barely piercing the darkness. She stumbled into the main lobby where Mia and Dr. Gray were waiting. "We have to go," she screamed. But the asylum wouldn't let them. The doors slammed shut, and the walls seemed to close in. The whispers became deafening, a cacophony of screams and laughter. Weeks later, a search party found the group's equipment scattered throughout the asylum. The footage revealed fragments of their ordeal: Ethan's possession, Rachel's encounter with the doctor, and the final moments of chaos. But the team was never found. To this day, Elderwood Asylum remains abandoned, a place of fear and fascination. Those who dare to enter speak of hearing whispers, seeing shadows, and feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. And at the heart of it all is the doctor, still searching for his next patient. The story of Elderwood lives on, a chilling reminder that some places are better left forgotten. In the heart of the bustling city, nestled between towering skyscrapers and neon-lit streets, was an unassuming little shop called Illyria's Emporium. Its window displays were a time capsule from the past. Vintage dresses, antique jewelry, and rows of mannequins adorned in styles from decades long gone. The mannequins were works of art, lifelike and intricate, with porcelain-like skin, glassy eyes that seemed to follow your every move, and hands sculpted with such precision they could almost be mistaken for real. Shoppers often remarked on their eerie beauty. Some avoided the store altogether, claiming the mannequins gave them chills. What the customers didn't know, and what the shopkeeper Illyria kept secret, was that the mannequins weren't ordinary at all. Illyria had inherited the shop from her grandmother, a woman whispered about in hushed tones. Locals claimed she was a witch, skilled in the dark arts of transformation and binding. When Illyria was a child, her grandmother told her stories of the mannequins, how each one had a soul trapped within it. "They were people once," her grandmother had said, her voice low and gravelly. "But they wronged me. They're paying the price now." Illyria had dismissed it as folklore until, on the day of her grandmother's death, she saw one of the mannequins move. Just a slight tilt of the head, a flicker of the eyes. She convinced herself it was her imagination, but deep down she knew the truth. Years passed, and Illyria took over the store, vowing to treat the mannequins with care. She polished their surfaces, dressed them in the finest clothing, and arranged them with reverence. But the curse remained. One rainy evening, as Illyria was closing the shop, a stranger entered. He was tall and gaunt, with sunken eyes and a voice like gravel. "I hear you have the most lifelike mannequins in the city," he said, his lips curling into a sly smile. Illyria hesitated. Something about him felt wrong. "We do, but we're closing for the night." The man ignored her and wandered through the store, his fingers brushing against the mannequin's cold hands. He paused in front of one in particular, a striking figure in a red dress, her face frozen in an expression of silent despair. "This one," he said. "How much?" "She's not for sale," Illyria replied quickly. The man chuckled. "None of them are they?" He turned to face her, his eyes narrowing. "I know what they are, and I know how to free them." Illyria's heart raced. "You need to leave," she said, her voice trembling. "I will," he said, stepping closer. "But first a warning. You may not have cast the curse, but you're part of it now, and curses have a way of spreading." With that, he left, leaving the shop colder and darker than before. That night, Illyria couldn't sleep. The stranger's words echoed in her mind. She told herself it was nonsense, but the unease lingered. The next morning, as she opened the shop, she heard something. A faint whisper. "Help me." She froze, her eyes scanning the room. It was empty, save for the mannequins standing silently in their places. "Please." The voice came again, weak and trembling. Illyria's gaze fell on the mannequin in the red dress. Its glassy eyes seemed different somehow, softer, more human. She stepped closer, her pulse quickening. Who's there?" The mannequin's lips didn't move, but the voice spoke again. "I am Clara. Please help me." Illyria stumbled back, her mind racing. It was impossible, yet here it was. "You're alive?" "I was," the voice replied. "Years ago. Your grandmother cursed me, and now I'm trapped. We all are." Illyria's knees buckled, and she sank into a chair. The weight of the truth crashed down on her. Over the next few days, the whispers grew louder. Each mannequin had a story, a plea for freedom. One had been a thief, another a scorned lover, and another a rival shopkeeper who had crossed Illyria's grandmother. Some claimed their punishments were unjust, while others confessed their guilt but begged for mercy. Illyria felt her resolve crumbling. She had spent her life maintaining the shop, but now she couldn't ignore the truth. These weren't just mannequins, they were people, and they were suffering. But what could she do? The curse was old and powerful, and Illyria had no knowledge of magic. One stormy evening, as Illyria was closing up, the stranger returned. This time she didn't tell him to leave. "You know how to free them," she said, her voice steady. "Don't you?" The man nodded. "I do, but it won't be easy." "What do I need to do?" He stepped closer, his eyes gleaming. "You must unbind their souls. To do that, you'll need to destroy the vessel that holds them, the mannequins themselves." Illyria's stomach churned. Destroying the mannequins meant destroying the shop, her family's legacy. "Is there no other way?" The man shook his head. "Curses require sacrifice. You must decide which matters more, the shop or their freedom." That night, Illyria sat in the shop surrounded by the mannequins. Their whispers filled the air, each voice pleading for salvation. Tears streamed down her face as she made her choice. She grabbed a hammer and began smashing the mannequins one by one. Each time a mannequin shattered, a faint wisp of light escaped, accompanied by a sigh of relief. When she reached Clara, Illyria hesitated. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Clara's voice was soft. "Thank you." With trembling hands, Illyria brought the hammer down. By dawn, the shop was in ruins. The mannequins were gone, their souls free at last. Illyria stood among the debris, her heart heavy but her conscience clear. The stranger appeared one last time. "You did the right thing," he said. "Their suffering is over." "What happens now?" Illyria asked. "Now," he said, "you begin anew." And with that, he vanished, leaving Illyria alone in the empty shop. Though she had lost everything, Illyria felt a strange sense of peace. The mannequin's lament was over, and for the first time in generations, the shop was silent.